Morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending upon what part of the world you are joining us from. It is a pleasure to welcome you all. Today's topic that we're going to discuss is controls constellation, mapping the cyber cosmos of threats. And it is a very novel approach that we're going to talk about today. Basically, the thing that we are going to discuss is how can we use our threat intelligence data pipelines and enhance our risk and controls ecosystem so that it drives much enhanced intelligence for our GRC ecosystem. But before we begin our journey today, we would like to introduce ourselves. Please.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Valentin Mihai. I lead the security engineering and technical program management team here within the CISO organization at Google Cloud, and I'm responsible for the tooling, the infrastructure to enable and achieve continuous assurance across our critical security, privacy, and compliance controls. I've got close to 20 years of experience in the industry. And I've held various roles over my career. And I look forward to talking to you all today about some of the interesting concepts that we're looking at. Back to you, Akash.
Hello, everyone. I'm Akash Verma. I'm a technical program manager for continuous assurance engineering team within Cloud CISO at Google. I'm in the same team as well. And our role is basically making sure that we have continuous assurance of our risk and compliance ecosystem. And that requires a lot of security engineering automation. And that's what me and Val specialize at Google Cloud. Beyond my current responsibilities at Google, I'm also working with National Institute of Standards and Technology and with Cloud Security Alliance on various industry standards and certifications that are required in the cybersecurity arena. And before Google, I actually have a decade of experience in all three lines of business, whether it's third line audit functions, second line risk functions, or the first line cybersecurity operations function. And just to throw it out over there, I have a bachelor's of engineering in electronics and telecommunication and a master's in information systems with a variety of cybersecurity certifications for whatever value that they hold. So moving on to the agenda of the session itself, the key things that we're going to talk about today is just a brief introduction and overview about what we are going to talk about, brushing up some of the GRC basics that we deal on a day-to-day basis, psychoanalysis of cyber threat, which is going to be more around, hey, how can we understand our threat actors and their tactic, techniques, and procedure better? And then ultimately the engineering abstract that's going to tie up the threat actors and their TTPs into the mode of the GRC metadata ecosystem that we have. So why are TTPs important, right? As we all know, in today's cyber realm, understanding threat actors and how they operate is very, very vital for robust cybersecurity engineering. By syncing security controls with how threat actors functions, we can enhance protection against specific threats. And the key three things that kind of drive us towards this initiative is how can we move towards how can we move from controls to supporting controls to control implementations to continuous controls monitoring, because it is very, very important to pinpoint the actual control implementation and how are they functioning. We also want to leverage threat intelligence because, as we all know, threat drives the inherent risk. Then the controls are being made, and then or depending upon how the controls are functioning, then we get the residual risk. So it's not only important for us to understand, hey, what are the threats, but who are those threat actors? How is their psychology? What are they performing? And how are we mitigating those TTPs? So to sum up, understanding threat actor psychology is fundamental for effective cybersecurity. Aligning controls monitoring, continuous monitoring, and leveraging threat intelligence enhances our defenses by at least 10x. And moving on to the next slide, which is around cyber warfare, right? Like now everybody knows that, hey, cyber warfare is the fifth domain. Cyber warfare is a new domain that we need to make sure that we defend against, right? Today, we are confronting a new reality. Cyber disruption is not just limited to our digital ecosystem. It also affects land, sea, air, and space. If we talk about land, cyber warfare extends beyond virtual realms, disrupting essential services like power and transportation on land. If we talk about sea, maritime operations rely heavily on interconnected system vulnerable to cyber attacks, jeopardizing transportation and naval defenses. If we talk about air, aircraft systems and air traffic controls are vulnerable to cyber threats, posing risks to aviation safety and national security. If we talk about space, right, satellites, which are very crucial for communication and surveillance, face cyber threats on a day-to-day basis, and which could disrupt the entire global ecosystem and operations around the communication. So in summary, cyber warfare disruption is not just limited to our digital ecosystem, but it also affects air, space, sea, and land. And if you look into the last five biggest breaches that has happened, if we look into not only the timelines but also the dollar amount value that those cyber breaches have affected, it keeps on increasing, right? Like if we start from Target data breach, that was in hundreds and millions of dollars. Then Yahoo breach kind of increased, and that increased to $350 million. And as we shift more towards the left, it's moving from hundreds of millions of dollars to billions of dollars to ten of billions of dollars, and it would keep on increasing. So moving on to a little bit about brushing up the GRC basics. You might be thinking, hey, why are we talking about threat-centric GRC rather than the risk-based or risk-centric GRC, right? Yes, we do the traditional risk management and threat modeling, but understanding our enemies and what drives them and what is their footprints, how they act is very critical and very important. If you look into the traditional risk management, right, most of those scenarios are, I would say, more likely like an hypothetical scenario, right? Like, okay, if a breach happens on a key third-party vendor, what would happen? What would be our probable maximum loss or estimated maximum loss? What controls do we have? Those drive more hypothetical intelligence, but we want more targeted protection. We want our defenses to be tied not only to the exact scenario that is happening around the world, but who the threat actors are and how they are performing is very important. A good example can be around rapid responses, right? We want swift actions against global emerging threats. A good example can be Russia-Ukraine war, right? And how can it impact an organization? How can it impact their products and assets? That's a very targeted protection, analysis, and intelligence that we want to drive. And it also helps us to enhance our security posture, which is making sure that we not only are able to analyze the current threats and their kind of the functionality, but also how can those threats evolve and what are the next set of actions that we can take from a controls perspective, so that we are not doing a reactive approach, but more like a proactive approach. And then the power of overlapping layers, right? Like defense in depth. I think this is one of the concepts that everybody, as soon as they enter the cybersecurity domain, they start working in cybersec or even in general IT field. Defense in depth is a concept that is known to all. And one thing that really intrigates me, or a model that I really love to explain this particular concept, is the Swiss cheese model, which basically means that, hey, make sure that our defenses are like the slices of the cheese, so that even if we have holes in one or two layers, the other layers block them. And if we just look into some of the examples that we have mentioned over here, right? Think about it as you can think about it as a Swiss cheese model, but also you can think about it as an onion, right? Onions have layers, right? So if we look into the examples over here, like policy management, data security, application security, each of them are layer. With starting with the most basic and the inner layer, which is the governance layer. That starts with policy management. You need to make sure that you have effective policy management over your data, application, endpoint, network, and perimeter. Then comes the next layer, which is around data security. Data resides everywhere, whether it's within application, endpoint, network, or perimeter, right? Then comes the application security layer, right? Like how is your AppSec working? That particular application is sitting on an endpoint. Hey, how secure is your endpoint? Those endpoints are connected to your network. How secure is your network? And those network resides within your perimeter, or whether your cloud service provider's perimeter. So how secure are your perimeter? That's another key thing. And to encapsulate everything, then the next step of analysis comes around external threat SecOps, which is where, again, we're going to talk about the threat actors and their TTPs. Psychoanalysis of cyber threats peeking into the minds of digital bandits. And this is a very, very important concept that we wanted to understand because human psychology is not only related or kind of pinpointed to cyber threat, it actually relates to all kinds of threats around the world. And the three key areas that we are looking over here, right? Like why are humans repeating themselves? Why do they behave in a certain way or a certain manner or in a certain pattern? And the first thing is the psychological comfort. Familiarity is something that all humans like, right? Even threat actors, they are very comfortable with their tactic, techniques, and procedure because those TTPs have led for their past successes. So they want to make sure that they perform same and same operation again and again so that they can have as much success as possible. Perceived success is again going back to my point, which is previous successful attack reinforces threat actors' belief in the efficacy of the chosen methods, leading to the psychological inertia and resistance to innovation. And the third one is the risk of detection. Basically, their human psychology mind says that, hey, we have not been detected before, so we might not be detected next time. So why not keep on repeating those techniques and procedures that we have been successfully using? Now, this brings to a very important paradox that human has, right? Threat actors prioritizes comfort over evolving landscape of cybersecurity defenses. However, this also increases the chance for their detection as well. So this is a kind of a balance. Both the cyber defenders and then the threat actors have to play against each other, so that it's kind of breaking of a chain where they don't get comfortable and keep on using the same TTPs again and again. So in conclusion, I would say understanding the psychological factor driving threat actors' behavior is essential for developing effective cybersecurity strategies. By recognizing and addressing these biases, we can enhance our defenses and stay ahead in the ever-evolving cybersecurity landscape. Now, deterrence against these weapons of mass disruption. Whenever we talk about weapons of mass disruption, we always think about, hey, what is the way or what is a standardized way that we can stop this attack or can secure ourselves, right? And me and Val, we always talk about this concept around, hey, is there a standardized way or a framework that can help us not only narrate the stories, but also drive more intelligence and more maturity in our programs? And the two key things that we always think our mind around is pyramid of pain and cyber kill chain. And what pyramid of pain basically means is it's a relationship between the type of indicators that an adversary might have or might leave, and how much pain would it cause them if we are able to deny those entry points to them. And the cyber kill chain is basically is a framework of outlining the stages where a threat actor move from initial reconnaissance phase to the exfiltration phase. And if we can stop or kill any of those stages in between, so that the entire path or the flow of the cyber breach is broken before they can exfiltrate or get to our data. Now, just an highlight of what this pyramid of pain means. So the pyramid of pain captures the relationship between the indicator of compromises and the level of difficulty that malicious actor experience when indicator of compromises are blocked by the security teams. And as you can see, if we look at the bottom of the pyramid, right, like hash values correspond to the known malicious files. It's very easy to block them, but it's also very easy for the threat actors to change the hash value of their software. IP addresses and internet protocol addresses can be changed by these threat actors very, very easily. So blocking them is not a good control. It's not a good way to block the threat actors. So we want to make sure that we move ahead in the top of the pyramid and are able to not only block the tools that they're using, which they heavily rely on, but also understand their techniques and procedure, understand their psychology, and able to block those TTPs using our mitigation strategies. Now, as we discussed in the previous slide, right, like the pyramid of pain, we want to make sure that we want to move from the bottom of the pyramid to top of the pyramid so that we can cause as much as pain to the threat actors as possible. And it's lists the different types of indicator of compromises, right? And we want to make sure that we increase the level of difficulty for the threat actors to breach into our systems. Now, threat intelligence, yes, threat intelligence is one piece. The current governance, risk, and compliance metadata is one piece of the information. Yes, threat intelligence is the evidence-based threat information that you can use. But focusing on just threat intelligence or just risk and compliance data is like fixating on a single section of the painting, right? Like you cannot see the entire picture. It's as you can see in the image, it just shows one face of the elephant that you're seeing. What basically means is adding context to an IOC is basically, hey, how do we tie our threat actors and their TTPs into a broader ecosystem of security incidents and the GRCs so that we can see the entire picture together? And this context can help the security teams to detect security incidents faster and take more informed approach in their responses, specifically trying to understand, hey, what kind of detecting and mitigating controls do we have against those threat actors and their actions?
No, thank you, Akash, for that great walkthrough. So just not going to spend a lot of time on these two pieces, but the indicators of compromise are observable evidence that suggests that there's a potential sign of a security incident. IOCs provide specific pieces of evidence that are associated with attack. You can think of an IOC as almost a trail or a set of data points that are provided that indicate that something has already happened. The challenge with IOCs is that at times they're not necessarily an exact confirmation that an incident has happened, but rather just some of the initial indicators. The next piece is the indicators of attack. So similar to the IOCs, which are sort of host, the IOAs or the indicators of attack help identify behavioral evidence of an attacker, including methods, intentions, etc. So for example, it could be observing multiple network connection attempts, specific processes, IP addresses that are trying to contact or to connect to systems, etc. Now, the reason why these are critical to the overall process is because they dovetail very nicely into the concept of continuous controls monitoring. So taking the concept of continuous controls monitoring, it involves the monitoring and analysis of security controls to ensure that they're effective and that they're working and they're providing the exact outcomes and objectives of what we're trying to accomplish, right? CCMs play a vital role in maintaining this proactive approach and maintaining and validating that the security posture, and we'll talk a little bit further in the slides as to, one, the maturity cycle and how the IOAs and IOCs actually dovetail quite nicely into the way that controls should be monitored by providing some foundational elements to establishing the types of signals that should be collected, considered, and assessed as part of that effort. Why specifically CCM and other forms of monitoring? I mean, CCM is just a way to, or continuous controls monitoring is a way to contextualize some of the data. I think natively it's potentially happening to some extent in a lot of organizations without necessarily categorizing it as controls monitoring, but effectively it ties in very closely to security compliance, risk, and governance practices that a lot of large enterprises and frankly a lot of organizations, if not all, should be running and operating under. The difference between CCM and perhaps other methodologies for risk management, or as a factor, as a contributing element to risk management, is that it is a data-driven decision-making process. At the same time, the flip side of it is that there are some inherent challenges in terms of resourcing constraints, complex integrations, identifying the right data sources, and frankly, just the sheer amount of data that can be generated from some of these systems. As we look at the overall process, there's three aspects to this triad. It's the threats, the risks, and the controls, right? With the threat actors introducing risk, organizations responding to risks through controls, and potentially those actors and those threat actors potentially adapting their methodologies, their tactics, or exploiting other methods in order to, again, reintroduce risk and gain access, right? So this continuous cycle of evolution is what needs to happen in perpetuity. And the quicker and the more effective organizations are at synthesizing that data in order to drive control improvement and control maturity, the more effective they are at their overall risk mitigation and response to these security threats. Here's a view of sort of a control life cycle that accounts for some of that. So this idea of to identify and assess the risks. So this is, again, based on that external threat activity, right? Design and implement controls. And in order to make them effective and scalable, automation becomes a very key aspect of it. and ensuring that that control then becomes rolled out, automated, which then needs to be monitored. The monitoring aspects have two elements to it. If you think about it from a maturity cycle, the initial sort of, let's say, the minimal aspects of it is to do something like passive monitoring. So whether it's log collection, log analysis, something like that, where you're more of the observer and you're monitoring the fact and you're looking at logs and data correlating that the control is up and running. In a more mature cycle, and ideally what we should be doing, like globally, and everybody should be doing it as part of their security practices, is to take a more sort of challenge-based approach, meaning that you want to move into controls testing. So passive observance and watching things that, hey, everything's green is potentially a great indicator. But the question is it green because it's working and everything's great? Or is it green because you're just not catching, or there's a misconfiguration or other challenges? And that's where the testing comes in. And then the testing is an element that helps validate the effectiveness of the controls and the mitigation of that risk. And ideally, that feeds into a continuous assurance cycle, which then sort of perpetuates the cycle. Kind of going back and taking this concept of CCM and tying it to the IOAs and the IOCs, right? When you look at the definition and at the creation of controls, right, you have to be able to identify the correct data elements to do it. And a way to identify the correct data elements that need to be part of that control assessment and that control measurement, one approach is to consume the IOAs and the IOCs. So in order to measure a control effectiveness and that a control is operating as designed, one method is to synthesize, let's say publicly available data or open source intelligence data around specific threats, actors, etc., and extrapolate and consume the IOA and IOC data and incorporate that as part of your control monitoring process and in your control definition, right? Which has two aspects to it. One, it drives the way that the controls are designed, but it also helps create a monitoring framework that's more aligned potentially with the real life scenario, right? And that's sort of what you're seeing on the left side. It's sort of the pre-boom, let's call it the hypothetical, almost the let's consume what's public knowledge and what's available. Now, what you have on the right side is the post-boom. So now that an actual event may have happened or an actual attempt may have happened. And what becomes critical is, again, you've had this sort of hypothetical or conceptual data that may be generally available, but now taking data that's potentially contextualized or applied to your specific environment and consuming that and synthesizing that as part of that control maturity cycle, again, helps improve the way that controls are designed, implemented, and matured, right? So going back to this previous view, as you continue to that cycle, the more data that's available, whether it's new publicly available data, event-based data that you extract as part of a postmortem, and having those insights and those data points incorporated into the control definition, the monitoring, and the testing, helps strengthen not only those controls from the perspective of making them more robust or more comprehensive, but it also grounds them in something that's a lot more tactile and tied to specific incidents or specific scopes and risks that they're trying to mitigate. Another view of this is what you have across the top is the incident lifecycle, right, per SP 861, right? What you're seeing below is this concept of the integration of control lifecycle governance into that same framework. And the idea that as part of the preparation, but also as part of post activities, similar to what we discussed on the previous slide, the data collection, those signals from the IOAs, from the IOCs, and other intelligence data that's available should be synthesized and consumed as part of this security control methodology that's helping strengthen the practices of what organizations are doing. So I'm going to go into the engineering abstract. I'm not going to spend sort of a lot of time, at least on this part of it, but this is just a general kind of structure of how a control, supporting control, scope, and then the control implementations are defined. So this is a sample data set here of what we're seeing of an example of how we want the control structure. One would set up a control structure. The idea being is that you have, for example, an overarching control followed by more granular supporting controls, which then have the implementations. And all the way to the right side is you have the monitoring elements. So the monitoring elements are fundamentally based off of the data elements that we've talked about previously in terms of the metrics and the signals. And the goal is to validate essentially two things. One, that the control implementation has been done correctly. So has it been implemented as intended? And two, as a way to validate that the control is achieving, or that the implementation is achieving the objective that was set out for the control. And sort of following the breadcrumbs, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, by looking at that signals data, you're able to determine and ideally assess and measure whether or not what has been implemented and what's active in the environment is mitigating effectively the risk and ultimately the threat that's coming in from the outside in order to protect the environment and the systems. We're going to talk about sort of this three-pronged approach of the basic building blocks. So on the previous slide, we talked about controls, control implementations, and the controls monitoring, right? And that's sort of very much focused on the right side of the equation, and that's very much part of, I would say, a traditional GRC system and the traditional GRC process. The incorporation of the threat actor, the tactics, the techniques, and the procedure, and assessing those or having those as contributing factors and establishing the relationship between those elements and the controls is an additional layer that is now tying sort of what would be traditional governance and risk methodologies to security methodologies, and allowing the usage of that same controls data and CCM data to drive a broader program within an organization that really adds an additional layer of measurement and correlation and data correlation by bringing in that threat aspect into risk mitigation and risk calculation and governance. We're going to leave this, I think, to folks just to be able to kind of drive through it and to review it potentially at your own pace. This is just, again, just an example of how the data would be structured in terms of documenting and establishing the relationships between these various data elements. Obviously, the signals and the telemetry aspects of it aren't captured here, and those would be dependent on the individual organization, the systems that you have, and where you want to integrate specific thresholds, et cetera. But kind of helping define what that structure looks like in order to be able to maintain that end-to-end association between the threat security data all the way to the telemetry that's generated as part of continuous controls monitoring, and how one can help mitigate and correlate to the other. So future considerations and Q&A. So the next steps is, or what we see as the top three focus areas for the next 2 years. It's an 80-20 principle, but fundamentally what it comes down to is mapping products and assets to threat actors and their TTPs, right? And this is essentially taking, we're calling it specifically in terms of products and assets, but ultimately what it is, it's extending the GRC practice to include these additional security elements. And the second piece being the mapping of IOCs and IOAs, whether it's the potential or the actuals, and incorporating those pieces as part of the signals that help measure controls, right? So incorporate them as part of the continuous controls monitoring framework of the organizations. Even if ultimately the metrics are distilled to coverage and effectiveness, these should be additional signals that contribute to either of those, right? And are part of that continuous improvement cycle that's part of the maturing of that framework. And then finally, it's to conduct hypothetical tabletop intelligence exercises in real time, right? So based on your organization, your vertical, the space that you operate in, identify potential threats, potential scenarios, and work through those with your teams as part of the natural progression and the natural maturity and review of your controls, security postures, et cetera. And again, kind of continuing that maturity cycle of improving the controls, the monitoring, and all of the other downstream elements. So on that note, thank you very much for attending our presentations. And if there's any questions, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. And thank you for taking the time to listen to us and participate in the conference. Have a great day, everyone.